What if death isn't the end? What if it's not a final goodbye, but a doorway into something deeper, something most of us were never taught to see? Psychologist Carl Jung, one of the greatest minds of the 20th century, once had a vision, not a theory, not a dream, but a direct experience, a glimpse beyond the veil. And what he saw wasn't heaven or hell. It was something far more intimate, far more symbolic, a temple, a presence, a confrontation with what he called the self, the true center of your being, far beyond your name, your job, or even your thoughts. In a world obsessed with the external, Jung left behind a message that cuts deeper than science or belief. The greatest mystery isn't out there, it's inside you. And if we dare to explore it, we might discover that death isn't something to fear, but something that reveals who we've really been all along. In this video, we're going to uncover what Jung actually saw during his near-death experience, why he believed it held the secret to the soul, and how that same truth might already be whispering inside you. This isn't something you'll hear in school. You won't find it in your psychology textbook. But once you hear it, you may never see yourself or your life the same way again. So stay with me, because what Carl Jung saw beyond the veil might just be the truth your soul has been waiting to remember. Let me take you back to 1944. Carl Jung, already one of the most brilliant minds in psychology, suffers a massive heart attack. He falls into a near-death state, slipping into a coma. Doctors are trying to revive him. But in that altered state between life and death, Jung reports something extraordinary. Something he would later describe not as a dream, but as a direct vision. And what he saw would forever reshape his understanding of life, death, and the self. Rediscover, he said, he left his body and floated high above the earth. He could see the planet as if from space, glowing, spinning alive. He described feeling immense freedom, as though all the pain, weight, and limitations of his body had dissolved. And then he saw something strange. Suspended in that cosmic vastness, he saw a temple, not a physical place, but something sacred, something eternal. It shimmered with a presence that words couldn't fully capture. Jung wrote, "It was as though I stood on the edge of the universe, and in front of me was a large stone temple. Inside I sensed the presence of ultimate knowledge, a kind of total understanding. And this is where it gets even more mysterious. As he approached the temple, he said he felt that if he stepped inside, he would never return to the world of the living. It wasn't fear. It was completion. It was the feeling of finally arriving somewhere you've always been meant to go. But just before he could enter, a voice called him back. A doctor, a friend, something pulling him toward life. And just like that, he woke up, back in the hospital, back in his body. But he was never the same. Now, what did that vision really mean? Was it a hallucination, a trick of a dying brain? Jung didn't think so. In fact, he believed it was a real encounter with a part of existence most people never reach while alive. He believed the temple was a symbol of the self, the true core of the human psyche, not the ego, not the roles we play, but the whole being, the totality of who we are, conscious and unconscious, light and shadow, divine and human. Let's pause here. Have you ever had a dream that felt more real than real life? A dream that didn't just show you something, but taught you something. Maybe you woke up with a strange clarity or a deep sense of peace that you couldn't explain. Jung would say, that's yourself speaking. The self doesn't use words. It speaks in symbols, in dreams, in moments of silence and awe when the ego finally steps aside. In Jungian psychology, the self is not just a concept. It's the deepest truth of who you are. It is the archetype of wholeness, the source of wisdom, creativity, and spiritual meaning. And the journey of life. It's not about chasing success status or perfection. It's about becoming whole, returning to the self. That temple Jung saw that was not out there in the stars. That was within. And here's where it becomes deeply relevant for us today. In a world dominated by ego noise comparison and endless distraction, how often do we actually sit still and listen to the self we scroll? We consume, we perform, but rarely do we look inward with the courage Jung had. His vision challenges us to ask, what part of me have I been ignoring? What am I really searching for behind all my goals and fears? What would I see if I dared to cross my own inner veil? Now, let's make this more personal. Jung said that the self often appears in dreams as ancient symbols, a circle, a mandala, a wise guide, a sacred space. Have you ever dreamed of a house, a temple, or a forgotten place that somehow felt familiar? That might not be random. That might be the unconscious trying to lead you back to you. Carl Jung once said, the self is not only the center, but also the whole circumference which embraces both consciousness and the unconscious. It is the center of this totality, just as the ego is the center of consciousness. In simpler terms, your ego is the story you know. The self is the book you've never finished reading. Let's bring this home. What Jung saw during his near-death experience wasn't just mystical. It was psychological truth wrapped in spiritual language. He saw that behind all our suffering, our striving, and our forgetting, there is something whole, something timeless, quietly waiting for us. And maybe you've felt it too. In a sunset that made you cry, in a moment of silence that felt holy, in a dream that refused to be forgotten. That's the temple. That's the veil. That's the self. And so, what do we do with this? We slow down. We start paying attention. We take our dreams seriously. We ask harder questions and stop settling for shallow answers. Because maybe like Jung, we don't have to wait for a near-death experience to glimpse the truth of who we really are. Maybe we can begin now by honoring that sacred voice within us before it's too late. So, what exactly did Carl Jung mean when he spoke about the self? Not the self we casually refer to in daily life, not the ego, not the me that shows up on a resume or social media profile, but something deeper, something most people live their entire lives without ever fully encountering. To Jung, the self wasn't just a part of you. It was the whole of you. And it wasn't just psychological, it was spiritual. Let's break this down. Most of us grow up believing that our sense of self is built from the outside in. Your name, your career, your background, your likes, dislikes, political leanings, relationship status. And yes, those things are real. But they're only the surface. They're what Jung called the ego, the center of your conscious identity. But underneath that, far beneath the personality and performance, lives the self. Jung described it as both the center and the totality of the psyche. The self is both the center and the circumference, which embraces consciousness and the unconscious. It is the center of this totality, just as the ego is the center of consciousness. It's like this. Your ego is a single room in a house. The self is the entire house, plus the land, the roots beneath it, and the sky above. Now here's where it gets interesting. The self is not perfect. It's not always peaceful, and it doesn't wear a halo. Why? Because it holds everything. The light and the shadow. Your deepest wisdom and your deepest fears. The parts of you you've embraced, and the parts you've buried. In Jungian psychology, the self is wholeness. It's not about being pure. It's about being integrated. Orostim. Well, this might sound abstract, but let's bring it into our world right now. In a society obsessed with image performance and identity, we're constantly being told who we're supposed to be. Productivity is praised, perfection is monetized, and vulnerability often punished. We learn to curate our lives to fit expectations of culture, of family, of algorithms. But what happens when we get everything we thought we wanted and still feel empty? What happens when we've built a perfect persona but can't remember who we were before we started performing? That's where the self begins to stir. Starhardings. Jung believed that most of our suffering comes not from what happens to us, but from the split between who we are and who we pretend to be. He wrote, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul." Think about that. We'll overwork, overconsume, overanalyze, overachieve, just to avoid sitting in silence with ourselves. Why? Because in that silence, the self speaks. And what it often says is uncomfortable. It doesn't flatter. It doesn't perform. It tells the truth. So how do we know we're touching the self? Sometimes it's through dreams that shake us to the core. Sometimes it's in deep grief or moments of awe. Sometimes it's when we feel like something ancient is looking through our eyes. The self doesn't show up in the spotlight. It often shows up in the cracks, in the moments when the ego loses control and something deeper takes over. Maybe you felt it. Maybe during a profound loss, or while looking up at the stars and suddenly realizing how small yet connected you are. That's the self reminding you. You are not your job. You are not your trauma. You are not your follower count. You are something deeper. Jung believed that the great task of life is what he called individuation, and the process of aligning the ego with the self. It doesn't mean the ego disappears. It means the ego bows to something greater, to wholeness, to wisdom, to the quiet knowing that your soul has always carried. But here's the challenge. The ego resists. It fears losing control. It fears change. It fears becoming honest. That's why the path to the self isn't easy. It requires confronting the shadow. It requires surrender. It requires saying, I don't have to be everything for everyone. I just have to be true. Now let's bring this even closer to home. How many of us have felt burned out, not just from work, but from pretending? How many of us have achieved external success only to feel internally lost? How many times have we said, I don't even know who I am anymore? That voice, that ache, that quiet despair, that's not weakness. That's the self knocking on the door of your awareness, asking to be let in. But here's the beautiful truth. The self never forces its way in. It waits. It waits for you to get tired of the game, tired of the masks, tired of chasing meaning in places where it was never meant to be found. And when you're finally ready, not to impress but to integrate, the self meets you there, not to judge, but to welcome you home. So, So the question isn't what is the self? The question is, are you willing to remember it, to return to it, to listen? Not with your intellect, but with your intuition, your dreams, your longings, your moments of stillness. Because that's where the self lives, not in noise, but in presence. Carl Jung didn't just discover the self, he lived in pursuit of it, and he left behind a map not to some faraway heaven, but to the wholeness within you. So maybe the next step isn't out there. Maybe it's inward, and maybe it starts with asking, what part of me have I forgotten? Let's get honest for a moment. Have you ever looked around and felt like something's missing, not in the world, but in you? You have the job, you're busy, you check your notifications, you make plans, you keep up. But inside, something feels off. There's a kind of ache you can't explain, a restlessness that no amount of scrolling, working, or numbing seems to fix. If that sounds familiar, you're not alone. According to a Pew Research study in 2024, 64% of Americans say they feel lost in their own lives. 64%. That's not a personal failure. That's a collective symptom. And Carl Jung saw it coming. Jung warned that when a society loses contact with the self, when people forget who they truly are beneath the surface, what follows isn't just confusion. It's crisis, psychological crisis, spiritual crisis, and eventually, cultural collapse. Because here's what he understood that we still struggle to grasp. When we forget the self, we don't just lose meaning, we lose ourselves. And what fills that void? Dopamine, distraction, performance, projection. We chase pleasure because we can't sit with silence. We fill our calendars because emptiness feels unbearable. We scroll until 2 a.m. because we've forgotten how to feel stillness without fear. Let's be real. How often do we actually sit with our thoughts? No music, no phone, no performance. Just us. And whatever truth is waiting to be felt. Most of us avoid that like the plague. Why? Because silence is where the self lives. And the self doesn't flatter. It doesn't applaud. It reflects back everything we've avoided. Jung believed that when the ego dominates and the self is suppressed, people begin to suffer in invisible but deeply dangerous ways. They may look fine on the outside, but inside they're anxious, depressed, disconnected. They lose their compass. They start searching for identity in ideology consumption or external validation. And here's the twist. The more you run from the self, the louder the symptoms get. Your relationships suffer. Your joy dries up. You feel like a stranger in your own life. Let's go deeper. Think about how many people today feel like they're living on autopilot. Wake up, work, check phone, repeat. Even rest feels like another task. Jung would say, that's not living from the self. That's performing for survival. And it's exhausting. Because when you disconnect from the self, you're forced to borrow meaning from external sources. And those sources are fickle. Trends change. People change. You get likes one day and silence the next. That kind of life creates a fragile identity, one that crumbles the moment it's not reinforced. Jung called this a spiritual starvation. We try to feed the soul with things it never asked for. More money, more noise, more likes. But it stays hungry because the self isn't interested in quantity, It's interested in authenticity, in depth, in integration, in truth. Wholeness. And here's the danger most people don't see coming. When we ignore the self long enough, we don't just become disconnected, we become vulnerable. Vulnerable to mass thinking, to shadow projection, to being swept up in movements and mindsets that don't belong to us. Jung warned of a world where individuals forget how to think for themselves because they've never learned how to feel themselves. And when enough people live like that, you don't just get psychological symptoms, you get societal symptoms. Polarization, ideological possession, moral panic, loss of empathy. Not because people are evil, but because they are unconscious. Let's pause here and ask something uncomfortable. How often do you feel truly connected to yourself? Not your role, not your habits, but your inner world. Do you remember your dreams? Do you reflect on your patterns? Do you know what your intuition sounds like? If the answer is no, again, you're not alone. But it means something important. The self is waiting, and it doesn't go away. It simply withdraws until you're ready. Jung believed that most modern suffering comes from trying to live a life without soul. And that word soul has nothing to do with religion here. It means your aliveness, your spark, your essence. When we suppress it long enough, we don't become neutral. We become numb. We laugh less. We love less. We lose our imagination. And without imagination, the future becomes terrifying. Because the self is where hope lives. It's where vision is born. It's where healing starts. Now, this isn't about blame. It's not your fault if you've forgotten the self. The modern world wasn't built to nourish it. It was built to keep you productive, distracted, and externally focused. But here's the good news. The self can't be deleted. It can't be erased. It waits. And the moment you turn toward it, even in the smallest way, through reflection, through solitude, through asking, "Who am I beneath it all?" it responds. So here's the question Jung would want us to ask. What part of me have I abandoned in exchange for being accepted? And is it time to come home? Because no external success, no praise, no performance will ever replace the quiet knowing that you are whole within yourself. Carl Jung didn't warn us out of fear. He warned us out of love, because he knew the soul can survive anything except forgetting itself. So, if you've been feeling lost, numb, or disconnected, it's not a breakdown. It's a signal. It's a call to remember. It's yourself asking you to return. So now the question becomes, if we've forgotten the self, if we've lost contact with that deeper part of who we are, how do we return? Carl Jung didn't just diagnose the problem. He also offered us a path. He called it individuation. Now don't let the word intimidate you. It's not about becoming perfect. It's about becoming whole. It's not about becoming someone new. It's about finally meeting the person you've always been, beneath the noise, the masks, and the conditioning. Let's get real. Most of us were taught to live from the outside in. Please others. Perform well. Stay busy. Avoid discomfort. But individuation flips that upside down. It says, stop chasing who the world wants you to be. Start remembering who you were before the world told you who to be. Because that version of you, the true self, is not gone. It's just waiting. waiting for you to stop performing, waiting for you to pause, to listen, and to come home. Now, individuation isn't a step-by-step checklist. It's a lifelong unfolding. But there are 3 core movements Jung emphasized in this journey. Let's walk through them together. The 1, facing the shadow. You can't integrate what you refuse to acknowledge. The first step on the path back to the self is turning toward your shadow, the parts of yourself you've judged, rejected, or disowned. This isn't about guilt. It's about honesty. Your anger, your envy, your shame, your fear of not being enough. They're not your enemies. They're unclaimed pieces of your truth. Jung said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." In other words, you don't grow by pretending to be pure. You grow by having the courage to look at what's real. When you face the shadow, you stop being ruled by unconscious impulses. You stop projecting your pain onto others, and you start reclaiming your power. 2. Connecting with the unconscious. Most people think of the unconscious as just a warehouse of forgotten memories. But Jung saw it as something far more alive. The unconscious, he believed, holds symbols, dreams, and archetypes that guide us when logic fails. Have you ever had a dream that stayed with you for years, or a recurring image that made no sense but felt meaningful? That's the unconscious speaking in its native language. It doesn't use words. It uses metaphor. It sends messages in the form of animals, places, people, and patterns. And when we ignore it, we miss out on the deepest wisdom available to us. So, part of individuation is learning how to listen to dream, to journal, to reflect, to ask questions and feel for the answers, not just think them. Jung believed this connection to the unconscious was essential, because otherwise, we live only from the surface. From logic, from performance, from what's been approved but never examined. And the more we listen to the unconscious, the more the self begins to speak. Or 3, reuniting with the self. This is where it all comes together. Individuation isn't just about self-analysis. It's about integration. Bringing together all the parts of yourself, the light and the dark, the conscious and unconscious, the wounded child and the wise adult. And when those parts are finally brought into conversation, that's when the self reemerges. Not as a theory, but as a felt presence inside you. You begin to move through life with more clarity, more authenticity, and more inner peace. Not because everything outside is perfect, but because you're no longer at war with yourself. Let's bring this home. Jung once said, "Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakens." It's one of his most quoted lines, because it's also one of his most true. We've spent so much of our lives looking outside, for approval, for answers, for validation. But the soul doesn't awaken in noise. It awakens in quiet, in stillness. In that sacred moment when you finally sit with yourself and say, "I'm ready to know who I really am." Now let's be honest, this path isn't easy. You might lose people. You might outgrow identities. You might have to sit with emotions you've spent years avoiding. But you'll also gain something priceless. Yourself. And when you walk through life with yourself intact, you become magnetic, rooted, creative. You stop reacting and you start responding. You stop chasing meaning and you start living it. This isn't about religion. This isn't about dogma. This is about remembering. Remembering that you were never meant to live as a fragment. You were meant to live as a whole. Not flawless, but integrated, alive, awake. And that journey doesn't start on a mountain. It starts right here, right now. With one question. What part of me is asking to be seen? So if something inside you has been stirring, if there's a quiet whisper saying there's more to me than this, you're already on the path. You don't need to rush. You don't need to have it all figured out. You just need to begin. So let's pause for a moment. We've explored Jung's vision beyond the veil. We've walked through the temple of the self, the silence of the unconscious, and the long path of individuation. But this journey doesn't end here, because it was never just about him. It's about you. Carl Jung didn't speak from a place of certainty. He spoke from experience, raw, honest, soul-shaking experience. And what he left behind wasn't a set of rules. It was a mirror. A mirror that asks, are you ready to look within? Because the self isn't an abstract idea, it's a living truth inside you. And it's been waiting patiently, waiting for you to get quiet enough, still enough, honest enough, to finally hear it. Maybe something stirred in you during this video. Maybe there was a sentence, an image, a moment that made you sit up and think, that's me. That's where I am. If so, that's not random. That's your inner voice. That's the self tapping on the door and saying, remember. Jung once said, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Not who you're told to be, not who the world rewards, but who you were before the forgetting. So here's the question I'll leave you with. What's one part of you that's been waiting to come home? If this video resonated with you, don't just scroll away. Pause, reflect, begin. Subscribe to this channel for more soul-centered content that doesn't just inform, but awakens. And let us know in the comments, what did this stir in you? What part of Jung's message felt like a message for you? You're not alone in this journey. You never were. But the path back to yourself, that's one only you can walk. And maybe that walk starts now.